Welcome to State of Open Subset from Open UK. My name is Lorna and I am a board director at Open UK as well as an open technology leader. Pleased to have you joining us for today's session. State of Open Subset is part of our annual conference State of Open Con. We had a lot more talks than we had track space for this year, so we're pleased to share at least some of those talks with you in this series. Each subset episode will also be available on our website at openuk.uk/subset and on our YouTube channel. Our speakers will join us live and they'll be around after their talk to answer questions. Although we're meeting digitally, all of the sessions are subject to compliance with the Open UK Code of Respect. Find it at the bottom of every page of our website. Feel free to share how much fun you're having on social. Use the hashtags OpenUK and State of Open Subset. Our speaker today is Andy Piper, podcaster, maker, educator, and developer relations professional. His work background includes Twitter, IBM, and Cloud Foundry, but you might also know him for his work on MQTT with the Eclipse Foundation or elsewhere around the open source scene. Andy's talk is about open source and why contributing now is more important than ever. There will be time for questions after the talk, so please stay with us for that. But for now, Andy, over to you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Piper, and I'm very honoured to be asked to present to the Open UK subset this year. I was actually awarded the honour of being one of the top influencers in the UK in the Open UK honours list this year, which was a great surprise, and it was a really special moment for me. And I was also able to attend State of Open a few months ago, and what a wonderful celebration of open technology in the UK. I was actually hosting the Open Source Initiative booth. So if you were there, you may have seen me. If not, then you'll be following me through this presentation and hopefully learn something. So thank you for joining this session, whether you're joining us live or whether you're following up later. I'm very, very happy to be here. And this session is going to be talking about contributing to open source, and in particular why it is, in my opinion, more important than ever. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide that you can see here is a lovely sketch note cartoon that I found whilst I was doing a bit of research and preparing this talk. And one of the things that is particularly special to me about this particular sketch note is that when I looked at it, I thought to myself, I recognized that style, although many sketch notes are done in a similar style. I looked at the name, Sasha, at the top there. And Sasha and I actually used to work together. We worked in the same company about 10 or 15 years ago. I worked at IBM. And Sasha, although she and I were never in the same offices or in the same projects, we got to know one another through IBM's internal social network and blogging platform back in the day. So it was really nice to see this cartoon. So I'm just going to take a few seconds, not to talk, just to leave this in front of us just for a moment to have a look through, and then I'll make some comments. So I know a cartoon can be a bit wordy, and there's a lot of things to zoom in on there or think about. But I really like this cartoon and the story that's told here. And this does talk about free software, and there is a difference, can be a difference between free software and open source software. But one of the things I love here is just a few of the points that are made here. It's like having gifts. It's like getting, free stuff. Each one of those gifts, one of those items of free software, one of those pieces of code is really something that you can have some fun with, learn from. And it's also, and this is important, we'll come back to it in a moment, a glimpse into somebody's life at the moment that they released that source. And you can combine them, build them up, and you could perhaps also create your own. So I really like this, and I just wanted to start off with this thought, and particularly for me, that sort of personal connection to Sasha. If you look Sasha up, she's very active in the Emacs community, which is an open source text editor that's been around for many, many years. Very popular, and Sasha does some great stuff around that community. She's based over in Toronto in Canada. So, my name's Andy Piper. You can find me. Many of these slides have my contact details at the bottom. So, andypiper.me is my links page. It's just a simple landing page. We can go and find different landing sites and other things that I get up to. I'm also in the Fediverse on Mastodon. My Mastodon handle is andypiper@macaw.social. So, if you want to mention me, comment to me, then I'm always interested to meet new people, learn from others, and hear what you thought of my content. So during this session, we're going to cover the basics. Along the way, I'm going to talk about my own personal journey in open source and open technology, and why I support some of the organizations that are involved in this space. So a very brief agenda for this session. And it's really a sort of a back to basics level setting session to some extent. So we're going to have a very quick think about what open source is, some of the specific things to be aware of around what it is you may or may not know about. And then much more practically, why get involved? Why does it matter? Why is it important in the world today? And what benefits can it have for you and as you get involved? And then finally, that more second level of practicality, how to get involved, the practical processes, places to go and look, ways to learn more. And along the way, as I mentioned, I'm going to sort of sprinkle in how I got started, where I've been and where I've come from, things I've learned. So I think it's really important that we start from a common baseline. So let's spend a few minutes talking about what we mean when we talk about open source, because open is a very easy word to use. It's a nice short word, great for throwing in the front of sentences. We're a very open company. We have a very open culture. What do we mean when we talk about open source, open software, open source software, open technology? What do we mean in this very specific context? I'm just going to challenge you just to think for a moment about what you expect when you hear the words open source. What does it mean to you? And also, what might it not mean? So what's the opposite, if you like? What is not open source? Or not necessarily opposite, but what just specifically what sort of questions should we be asking when we're presented with something that someone refers to as open source? And here's a great example that came up recently. Chris Pirillo is an influencer that you may have come across. He's been online for many years. I followed him across different platforms. Great person to follow to find sort of new trending sites, new tools, new technologies. And not that long ago, in April, he posted on his Mastodon account and said, hey, this is a cool thing, chartgpt.dev, a tool that converts text into beautiful charts. #AI, #open source. Now, AI, right? AI is hot right now. We know that. We hear it all the time. ChatGPT and other things like that. So real eye catcher that we have immediately there. So, I mean, I certainly zoomed right in and paid attention and thought, oh, this sounds interesting. Look, the screenshot here even has that GitHub logo. It's got, star it on GitHub. It must be open source, right? It's right there on GitHub. So the code's there. And well, this person, Paul Barker, has followed up and said, hey, Chris, can you explain how this is open source? If I actually click through to the repository there, I'm not seeing a license. And if I want to use that code myself, then I'm going to have to pay for access to the OpenAI API, and that's proprietary. So I've got a dependency on something that is not free and open to use. So can you sort of define that? And actually, certainly at the time I took this screenshot, Chris hadn't replied to that, but it's a really good example of the questions to be asking. Just because some code is free, just because the code is there and you can see it, does not necessarily mean that it's open source. Free code that you could get sued for changing or making your own, hosting your own copy of a service, something that you can't practically rerun for yourself, something that you're not practically free to do what you want with, just because you can see some code, even if you can contribute to that code, that doesn't mean that your contribution will be under an open source license. So it's really important to be aware of what you might think of as fake or captive open source, partly because some organizations want to appear to be open, want to say, hey, look at us, here's our code. And that can be very valuable. We want to be able to see things. Transparency is useful. But is it open source? Is that code under a free license that is recognized by the open source initiative that I'll talk about in a moment? Does it have any license associated with it? And can I reuse it and do what I want with it? Some of the database vendors are a good example here, where they found themselves under increasing competition, or they found that they wanted to build a commercial model, so they have changed the licenses to server-side licenses of some form that have got some detail in them that mean that they're not free to use in the same way that they used to be. And another good example recently is Twitter's algorithm famously has become open source, or was said to be, released and open, and there it is on GitHub. But I'm going to ask you again, if you think about that, if you were to go and look at that algorithm on GitHub, could you do anything with it? Can you change it? Can you modify it? You actually need to know Scala, which is free and an open source language, but there's a lot of components that algorithm depends on that you can't get access to because they're not open. You can't give particular feedback, and if you did make changes to it, they wouldn't necessarily be used by Twitter. So this is absolutely key. Code that does not have an open source initiative approved license is really important. And the OSI essentially defines what we mean by open source, and they look after the open source definition. Now, one of the things I was quite surprised by whilst I was at State of Open, I was on the OSI booth for both days of State of Open. So you may have met me there and hopefully taken some of the stickers and possibly looked into becoming a member. The OSI is actually the organization that recognizes the definition of open source, and it was set up back in 1998 by Bruce Perhams and Eric Raymond and others. The term was coined back when the code for the Netscape web browser was first being prepared for release to the community. And it was also very rapidly adopted by another new project at the time, which was called Linux. This is going back 25 years. And it was very heavily based on free software definitions as well from the Debian project at the time. But open source code has an OSI approved license. And that means that there are a number of principles that it needs to fulfill, needs to abide by. So if you're using code that's under the Mozilla public license, the MIT license, GNU public license, Apache software, Apache license, and so on, there's a number of them that are OSI approved that meet these 10 principles. A few of them are really obvious: free redistribution, freely shared with others without restriction is actually there's a couple of little intricacies in there. The integrity of the author's source code. Some other things you may not be aware of, in particular things like no discrimination against people or groups, or against fields of endeavor. So if you make some code open source and it's used in a way that you don't like, that's unfortunate, but you can't have a license on it that discriminates against how it's used. So there's a few things in there that are really important to understand, and we'll come back to the OSI and the importance of really defending that definition later on. In the meantime, let's move on to why get involved. So we've done a quick level set. We're talking about software and technology that comes under an open source initiative approved license. There are some quite well-known licenses, although you may not have read them all in detail. It needs to be clearly applied to the assets. So why get involved, and why in particular do I say it's more important than ever, in my opinion, to get involved? Why spend your time on open source, using it, but in particular contributing to it? Well, if we rewind 25 years to when the open source initiative was being formed, these terms and licenses were just becoming things. Open source software was much more on the fringes of the software industry and of our daily lives. And I, at the time, was just leaving university, and almost all of the software I was using was proprietary. It was Windows, Microsoft Windows back at the time, a bunch of mainframe software from IBM, Lotus Notes, other things that were all under commercial licenses. Didn't have smartphones. Any phones we did have was certainly proprietary. Mobile-wise, I think I had a Nokia back in the day. So it was still a great thing to get involved with open source and learn about, but most companies sort of shied away from it, and it wasn't necessarily a core thing. One of the things I worked on was I was at IBM for 10 years between 2001 to 2011. And I worked with hundreds of amazing engineers in IBM's Hursley lab, which is down near to Winchester in Hampshire in the UK. And almost all of them at that time explicitly did not work with open source code. IBM is now a very large contributor to open source projects, but at that time, there were very good reasons why IBM chose not to be involved with open source particularly strongly. And although they used open source assets such as the Apache Web Server, and in fact, in many cases, engineers were explicitly prohibited from using open source. Now, this is an image created by Midjourney, an AI software tool, and so this is definitely not a picture of the IBM lab 25 years ago, but it was really sort of trying to show just how different the world is today. And before we move on to where we are right now, I'm going to talk you through where I've come from in that period of time. So hopefully you can see some of the value that's happened through being involved with open source communities and software. So this is how things happened for me. 1997, I left university with a degree in modern history. So I have a degree in humanities subject. I'm self-taught entirely in technology. I've always been interested in computers. I learned to code in BBC Basic back in the 1980s and 90s. But before about the year 2000, I was beginning to learn some C and PHP. I was installing Linux at home. I was lucky that my employer at the time, the UK Post Office, sent me on a course to learn HP Unix, HP UX, because that gave me a really good foundation in Linux. And for me, it was always natural to sort of share what I was learning, write about what I was doing, find other free software to learn from. It was often called public domain software back then, or shareware. Shareware was generally, people were hoping that you would give them a bit of money to get their code. But there was a website called SourceForge, and it's still around today. But one easy way of thinking about it is, as the early version of GitHub, it had a source control mechanism, which was something called CVS. So it's really a precursor to Git that we use today quite often. But I also at the time learned some other older systems, like one called RCS, Revision Control System, and one called Microsoft SourceSafe that I used at work. And I was doing some coding, finding projects on SourceForge. I was using the Linux GNOME desktop that was being developed in different online repositories. I got involved around the year 2000 with the game Unreal Tournament, because the company behind it released the source code for the client so that some Linux developers could try to get that to run on Linux. And I got involved with that project, which was really fun. Then in 2001, I actually got a job with IBM. And at the time, I was able to be hired by IBM as a experienced employee. I joined the post office as a management trainee and gone into their IT division. But with IBM, I joined as an experienced technology person. And I was internally continuing to use some CVS, but they have their own source control mechanisms, proprietary ones, CMVC, and they purchased a company called Rational that had another proprietary piece of software called ClearCase. Some competitors to CVS appeared. There was another tool called Subversion, which the Apache Foundation used a lot. And I started to get involved through the software stack that IBM software was built on. So the Apache web server continues to be very popular today, but was absolutely the main web server back then. And although I was originally given a ThinkPad, an IBM ThinkPad at the time with Windows on it, I soon installed Linux because I preferred it. And then I started contributing to IBM's internal Linux distribution, which was at the time built on Ubuntu, which is probably a Linux distribution you may have heard of. Learned a little bit about packaging software for Linux, started getting involved with Ubuntu a little bit, running it at home as well. Then I met some people from the UK Ubuntu podcast who became friends of mine, got involved with that podcast, learned about their open source management tools called Launchpad that Canonical were using for managing Ubuntu. So really getting lots of experience, and through my own interests, I'm a techie at heart. I'm sitting right now as we record this session in a lab with lots of fun gadgets all around me that I build for fun, because that's one of my hobbies. I recognize that not everybody wants to practice tech as a hobby as well as practice tech as a career. So I appreciate that this may be a different path for other people. The other exciting thing that I got involved with at IBM was they had a technology called MQTT, which is an Internet of Things messaging protocol, lightweight messaging. And they actually wanted it to become more popular. So they had a specification which was open. It was published as a specification on the internet, but they hadn't released the code as under an open source license. And as I left IBM in 2011, we were able to make the code for MQTT's, IBM's implementations of MQTT, open source at the Eclipse Foundation, and I became the first project lead for that project. So I actually went to another company at the time, VMware, to work on an open source project for the first time, sort of professionally, called Cloud Foundry. And I continued to support MQTT through the Eclipse Foundation, and we were involved in setting up the Internet of Things working group that had its 10th anniversary last year. On my first day at VMware, I was committing code on an open source repository for Cloud Foundry, which was really exciting. And at that time, really Git and GitHub became absolutely central to how people were building software online and sharing. And then the final phase of my career that brings us up to date is the last 9 years. So I was working for another company, but I was continuing to learn from projects on GitHub through my hobby. Now there are other source control hubs. So GitHub is a clear central one that's owned by Microsoft, and it's very popular. But there are other places to go for your code. There's GitLab, which is an open source alternative to GitHub. There's another one called Codeberg. And I think it's important to be aware of the alternatives and to maybe get involved with some of those. My previous employer was Twitter. I was there working a little bit on some of their open source projects, but primarily working with people building third-party code that used the old Twitter API. And that was really exciting. And then finally, I got involved with a project called MicroPython, and MicroPython's about to celebrate 10 years as an open source project. It's Python for embedded small devices, and that's been a really fun community to get involved with. And then the Fediverse, Mastodon, PixelFed, and other tools. So I'm very excited by the opportunities that open technology brings to us. Now, through all of that stuff that I've just gone through, I was also using the tools that enable people to work in a distributed online, common open source manner. So mailing lists, internet relay chat, IRC, Discord is more common these days, or Matrix, and chat forums, bug trackers. There's a ton of skills in there that you can reuse because, of course, if you're at work, you may be using Slack, which is similar to Discord. You may be using your own internal bug trackers of some form. So there's a lot of common collaborative skills that you can gain from working in these projects. And then also understanding that people are in different time zones, working at different paces. There's so much opportunity to learn, to grow, to help others, to build, contribute to the happiness of other people as well as your own, which I think is a really important thing, and to build and contribute to the diversity of projects that exist online. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But what this slide is illustrating is that we live now in a world where open source has won. And we really just live and breathe with systems that use open source components. What a difference from 25 years ago. But that does not mean that open source is no longer important to think about and talk about and contribute to just because it's everywhere. It's inevitable today that you will be using systems and code somewhere in your life that are open source at the heart. You may be using an Android phone, you may be using an iPhone. A lot of the Apple stuff is built on open source projects. They contribute to open source as well. You may be have your smart assistants at home. You may be using AI systems, which we'll talk about some more, that are all built on models that have been contributed to by open source. And indeed, out there in space, we have robots on Mars that are running open source code. We have Python running on Raspberry Pis on the International Space Station. The James Webb Space Telescope, the imagery from that is managed through a lab in Dublin, where they do all of the analysis and reformatting to make those beautiful pictures of far off nebulae and universes and galaxies using open source code. And that's phenomenally exciting. Now, if you build some code and share it, then that first time that you put it out there, it's still only you that's run it. Or almost certainly, it's, there's a chance that you maybe had a couple of friends try it before you published it or released it. But fundamentally, if you're going to create a repository on GitHub and put your code there, then until someone else finds it and runs it, it's just your code. But when that other person picks it up and runs it, then that's validation that the problem that you want to solve for yourself is one that other people have had as well and want a solution to. And that's a pretty cool thing. But they might not have the same context as you. They might be running a different operating system or web browser or use case, running in a different language, Unicode characters, different accents and so on, left to right, right to left languages might behave differently. It might make your code operate in ways you don't expect. So other people might find an issue that you didn't know your code had. So that's where we start to talk about the concept of more eyeballs making bugs more visible, or just providing more brain cycles to a problem to improve the way that something is written. And plus, through doing all of this, through people finding your code, recognizing it, possibly contacting you, then you're growing your network. Contributing to other people's code is also really, really helpful because it helps you to understand it in much more detail. And it might help you to learn other things as well. Software stacks can be complicated, so you may end up debugging something or trying something that runs in your browser, or you might need some server-side components, and then if you need some JavaScript that runs in Node, and you might need to get the right version of Node, and then you might need to get the right version of Linux or whatever. There may be a set of things that you end up debugging and learning about the internals of something and learning some new skills. What you might also find is if there's a feature that you really wanted in some software and you go to add it, you might realize that the person who wrote the software in the first place had never intended it to be used in that way. And actually adding that thing that you thought would be really easy is much more complicated than it looks. And then you suddenly start to realize and respect other people's motivations and code more. It's like Sasha said in her cartoon that we looked at the beginning, that you get that window into somebody else's life, somebody else's thinking. And that's a really great way of learning. Right now, I'm someone that's just been through a layoff in the tech industry, and things like having open source on my CV or resume, having experience working in distributed communities, collaborating with others around the world is really useful. And I spoke to somebody recently at an Open UK meetup who actually came up to me and said that he'd hired somebody through a recent recruitment effort specifically because that person had contributed to open source, had a GitHub profile, was doing things in the open source community compared to other people that were on the shortlist. People are interested in whether you've contributed meaningfully, looking at how you approach solving problems, how you respond to feedback is really important as well, because not all feedback will be necessarily presented in a friendly way. We hope that it would be, but that's a challenge, needing to understand how you respond to feedback when you've released some code or you have made a contribution and someone's given you some feedback suggesting you improve that contribution. Looking at whether you're self-starting enough to get involved in something that you had no particular motivation to get involved in other than you cared about it. I'm really looking at what you learned. So open source contributions can definitely help you to get a job. And there's so much more. And I honestly could spend so much time going through every single bullet point here, but very, very quickly, as I mentioned already, it's great for networking. It's great for getting to know different communities. You don't have to stick with one group. You can cross-pollinate between different communities you might get involved in. It's a great way to build confidence. It can be challenging as well, but I think that over time, certainly my belief is that over time, it helps to build confidence. It can provide a lot of satisfaction, and I think it will also provide a lot of fun. I certainly really enjoy it on good days. Okay, so that's a lot of stuff about what open source is and why it's important to get involved. And I'll talk yet more about that in a few moments, why it's important and why it's most important right now. But let's look at some practical things about how to get involved. And there is a generalized process that I'm going to very quickly talk through. So this is kind of if you like, abbreviated version of what a process might look like if you wanted to contribute to an open source piece of code on GitHub. It would be quite similar on different source control platforms or hubs. It might be slightly different, but it's probably also quite similar if it's not a code contribution, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in terms of GitHub, you're going to sort of go through this process. Make a copy of the project, make some changes, figure out what you did and then what you want to contribute. Before we go down the other list of things here, beyond the first bullet point, you might, in the meantime, go off, run the code, make a load of changes, decide you want to contribute, go all the way through the process of forking the project, making a branch, making your changes, creating a patch, and get all the way up towards the end. But one of the important things to look at is what the license of the code is. and what will happen to your contribution when you contribute it. So check the license, check whether the repository has a contributing.md file or any other kind of guidelines telling you how to get involved. And if you're creating your own project, it's a really good idea to start off by saying, I'm interested in contributions. I welcome your contributions. I'd love to know what you do with my code. Here's how you can help me to test this. And I want to create a patch, send that patch, and then handle any responses and feedback suggesting changes or asking you questions about why you made the patch. But what is the license? And this is an example I had very recently. I've been building a pen plotter for use in my lab here, and I was using somebody else's code. And in this case, I'd been making some changes, and I discovered that there was no license in the repository. So I raised an issue and I said, hey, there's no license here. I'd love to send you some patches, but I don't know what the license is. And this person said, actually, at the time, I released this a few years ago, I didn't really know about licenses. So what would you suggest? What would you be happy with? And I said, yeah, look, I'm happy with these things. So hopefully he's going to add a license, and I'm going to be able to get involved here. What if you don't code? That's awesome. Open source needs so much more than just people who can code. It needs people to help test, file issues. If you're going to file issues on a project, then be as helpful as you can, be as detailed as you can. Really explain the problem you've had, how it came about, list the steps that happened to get you to that point, and provide information to help the maintainers or the people that are writing the code to reproduce and help you to fix create a fix themselves. People also need help with documentation. Many developers are not great or don't wish to write documentation. They wish to spend more time on the code. They may not have design skills. Translations are always challenging. People tend to write in the language they know, which I think is quite common and understandable. And the software industry has a pretty big issue with sort of a lot of code languages expecting you to know English. So localization, translations are almost always welcome in projects. Helping others across the community, and then also helping to promote projects you're interested in and getting them more visible, getting them more people to get involved. So I'm hoping, getting towards the end of the talk, but I'm hoping that I've given you some excitement, interest in getting involved. So where are you going to go and find out about these projects? You don't know what to do. You want to get involved in something, you're not sure where to start. Well, I often start with something I'm using. If I'm using some software which I recognize or discover is open source, has a repository, has a website, I want to make a change, I want to make a fix. I'm one of those people that spots typos and wants to help people improve their documentation as well. So I tend to spot those and send improvements there a lot. That's a starting point. There's a few great communities around online. Code Newbie is one of them. And dev.to is a great site as well. They have a weekly Who is Looking for Contributors post, which looks a little bit like this. So in this case, who's looking for open source contributors, week 38. And there's a nice little paragraph in here where Becca calls out the fact that open source really is intended to be, we want it to be welcoming and inclusive. And that inclusivity and diversity are important as well. When we write something, whether it's written text or a piece of code, or we draw something, create a piece of art, it's done from our cultural perspective. And we may not understand immediately the perspectives of others. So actually absorbing those perspectives, learning from those perspectives, engaging with those perspectives is super important in open source. And also, Becca points out here, look, that it's really helpful in your repository. If you're going to ask for help, please have a README, please have a contributing file, help people to help you. Respect and patience are really important. People may be in different time zones. If you ask a question or raise an issue on a Wednesday, it might only be that person's hobby. Then they may only get to look at it on a Saturday or a Sunday when they're got some time away from their kids, or maybe only during their vacation. So you may need to be patient, and you should really just, it's always good to respect the work of others and other people's time. So I really hope that I've excited you, made you start thinking about contributing to open source some more if you have already, or for the first time if you haven't done so before. And Open UK has a series of meetups throughout the year, and there are people in the community who are excited to help you to start contributing. So do ask us to help if you're not sure how to get started. But I wanted to share a few final thoughts that I think are really critical to why I'm talking about open source right now, and what I learned from being a state of open, and finding that not so many people had heard of the open source initiative. Now, this statement has so many meanings, and I will fight for this statement. I made this statement. This isn't from a famous author or quote. This is just a statement which I believe in. But in the case of open source, it's really important to understand that we need collective voices to continue to explain the importance and values of openness in order to avoid things being quietly or overtly taken away from us or changed around. AI is a great example, and it's really the key example right now. Everybody is talking about this. All of the big tech companies are competing in this space, scrambling to compete in this space. OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, was called OpenAI on the basis that they were open in their approach for the first few releases, until with ChatGPT 4, suddenly they decided that they're no longer going to release the models behind everything and all the decisions that ChatGPT 4 is making. They have shut off transparency of how those models were trained, the biases that might be included in those models, because they say it was a mistake in the first place to be open about this because AI is such a critical thing. Well, you can say that, or you can see it as a you know a competitive advantage to do that. Now, Clement Delong here has posted a fantastic tweet recently saying, when they announced Hugging Chat from Hugging Face, the open source AI company, that these things are important: transparency, inclusivity, accountability, and distribution of power. And absolutely, we need to understand how things are biased, why things are biased, how decisions are being made on our behalf. Diversity of viewpoints and opinion are important. I've seen this happen here. I'm seeing this happen in the AI space. And the answer to me is not to close up and everybody to compete with one another. The greatest advances in humanity have been made when humans have collaborated, not when humans have competed necessarily. And I see the same things happening in open source hardware as well as in software, where some of the open source hardware manufacturers who've been very successful with an open model are now looking at ways to protect their IP. And that makes me really sad, because if you look at companies like Arduino, they've been super successful by building and being as open as possible with their platform. And actually, with companies cloning their platform, they're just gaining more people that are using it and becoming familiar with it. It's such an opportunity. So really, in conclusion, I want to leave you with some thoughts, and I don't want them to be negative ones, but I do want us to be aware of them. Community is hard, communication can be hard, but getting involved, learning, growing together, excellent. And freedom is vital. So with that, I'm going to end the session, end the formal talk. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to talking more with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you think you have a talk that would fit with Subset or State of OpenCon, let us know. We will open the CFP for State of OpenCon in the summer, but if you want to speak on Subset, you can drop us a note at admin@openuk.uk with your bio, your talk proposal, and tell us why you want to join us. Sign up for the Open UK newsletter. The link is at the top of every page on the website. Come along to our meetups, join our events, meet the team. For Subset, our next talk will be on the 23rd of May, and it's Ruth Ikiga from the Chaos Project. So I look forward to that.